Hello. It's quite clear that the economy isn't working, or rather, it isn't working for the majority of people. Now, the public wants answers and alternatives, which explains why both Reform and the Greens who are kicking against the establishment, albeit from very different directions, are on the rise. One of the reasons for the rise of the hard right or the far right is that people see the current taxation system failing. They pay lots of taxes, but the public services don't seem to improve, rather they worsen. However, new economic ideas are starting to bubble to the surface for the first time since the 1970s, when the current model, neoliberalism, which I've spoken about in a previous video, became the dominant economic model. Now, under the neoliberal economic model, politicians have obsessively focused on growing the economy, whilst promising their policies would end poverty. But it's clear that policies based on the neoliberal economic framework have failed. In a world that is richer than ever before, roughly 1/10 of the world's population still lives in extreme destitution. And in developed nations such as ours, wages have stagnated, workers become precarious, public services have been cut to the bone, and food banks have become ubiquitous. Apart from the most wealthy, who've become even more wealthy, this does not feel like the prosperity successive governments have promised. We want to be paid a decent living wage and to have employment guarantees. We want the government to invest in public services such as the NHS so that there are sufficient medical staff to cut waiting times. We want the government to take back control of strategic assets such as those that provide us with clean water and clean rivers. And we want the government to invest in infrastructure projects which benefit society and the environment. The question is, how can politicians achieve those aims when they simply say there's not enough money? But there is a school of economic thought that claims to have the answers. It's actually been around for a while, although on the fringes, and it's called modern monetary theory, or MMT for short. In reality, it is not a theory at all. It's the way that money works in a modern economy, especially in a nation that has monetary sovereignty. That is, it has its own central bank and can issue its own currency. And this is being increasingly discussed by some politicians who are now beginning to show interest, especially among the Green parties. And here in Hos, Scotland, it is here that the debate about modern monetary theory has actually been most lively. And the reason for that is because of the interest in Scottish independence. Many independent supporters believe Scotland should have its own currency simply as a matter of national pride. However, part of the independence movement actually also backs the modern monetary theory, as they believe it would allow a newly independent Scotland to forge the type of socially democratic nation they want, and which the SNP claims it wants as well. Many of our problems are down to the misunderstanding of what money and debt are. So mainstream economics sees governments like households with limited finances and the need to therefore to balance their budgets. And if the government is a household, therefore, we cannot allow the government to be in debt. Modern monetary theory says that's nonsense. A government can never be considered similar to a household when it has a central bank and is the currency issuer. A household is not a currency issuer, it is a currency user. Neither, for that matter, is the Scottish government, which, like a household, does have to balance its budget because it can't issue its own currency as a nation that is dependent on Westminster. And that places limits on what it can do. Everything is paid by money creation. Private banks are licensed to create money by the government. Now, most money in the economy is created not by printing notes, but by banks when they provide loans. If you borrow £100 from the bank, it doesn't take money from the savings accounts of other people. That money has been created electronically. It didn't exist until it was credited to your account. And as you pay off the loan, the electronic money your bank created is deleted. It no longer exists. And interestingly enough, that's exactly the same as what happens when governments spend money and when we pay our taxes. So governments actually spend money first. They spend the money that they need in order to finance public services such as the NHS, public welfare, education, and defense, etc. And then they tax some of it back. When you pay your tax, the tax money doesn't pay for what the government does. It is simply deleted in the same way that the banks delete the money off your account when you repay them. Now, if governments can create money to fulfill their political ambitions, and if those ambitions are to have a well-being economy that is good for all and not just the rich, then of course the governments can create money to fund full employment, rebuild public services, and improve national infrastructure, etc. So what is known as fiat money is created by governments running a deficit. And what is known as credit money is created by banks increasing the level of private debt when they loan money to private individuals or businesses. And incidentally, every pound of government deficit is a pound of credit in the private sector, together with the foreign sector, which is money belonging to other nations that is held in the Bank of England, their own Bank of England reserve accounts. Only central banks or commercial banks and certain important institutions like the National Health Service and foreign governments can hold money in Bank of England reserve accounts. Money from banks is used for consumer spending, and fiat money from government provides public services that aren't profitable for the private sector. We should never expect private companies to operate our sewage system, for example. It simply takes too long to be profitable. Whereas the government can create money for education, infrastructure, health and social welfare, and all the rest of our public assets and services, which should never be run on a for-profit basis and therefore never privatized. The question that is always raised, and the main criticism that is leveled at MMT, is that it will create a spiral of inflation with too much money pumped into the economy. Heterodox economists, which is what MMT economists call themselves, say that governments should use taxation to take excess money out of the economy and prevent it from overheating. So according to MMT, government spending is a bit like water running into the basin of the economy. Taxation is simply draining the water away at a rate that allows the water level in the basin to remain at a certain level to be sufficient to keep the economy in balance and to have enough money circulating in the economy. The government creates money in order to spend that money on important projects to improve the lives of its citizens. And when there's too much of that money in circulation, tax is used to cool the economy down. Taxation can be used for other aims as well, such as in order to redistribute wealth or to impact consumer spending. And if governments can create money through central banks, governments can never fall short of funds. It's not that MMT has discovered some property of money that was unknown. That has always been the case. Governments, therefore, cannot run out of money. You can have problems with inflation. You can run out of resources. And of course, when you run out of resources or when you put too much demand on resources, you will get inflations. And there are all kinds of things that can go wrong. But there is no scarcity of money. Now, it's a huge shift of mindset to think of taxation as a brake on inflation rather than as a prerequisite of government spending. Equally, accepting the notion that governments can create money to fund public spending requires a big leap of faith. So these ideas are resisted by mainstream economists because it involves a complete shift in perspective. In addition, huge amounts of money, often so-called dark money, are being poured into right-wing think tanks, which support the current economic system and also support the views of parties like Reform and Trump's version of republicanism. So the scales are heavily tipped against heterodox economists even getting a hearing because they're seen as cranks. The same was done, incidentally, to Galileo when he said that the Earth is not the center of the universe. The Earth and all the planets revolve around the sun. The shift in worldview was too much for the religious establishment, which is why he was condemned by the Inquisition, despite being absolutely right. Heterodox economists say, prove us wrong, and when you bring us evidence to the contrary, we'll change our minds. It's basically a good scientific approach to the question. In my next video, I will deal with the question of fiscal rules and fiscal responsibility, and with what government borrowing is and what it is not. Thank you.